I'm Granny Rhea.
And I'm Auntie Donia.
And we're here to talk about super special kids and cake.
Yes, cake!
We're coming to you from the studios of Sacred Heart University in Fairfield, Connecticut. This podcast is brought to you by our book, Let's Talk, Social Communicative Services and Supports for Your Young Child with ASD, published by Paul H. Brooks and available from Amazon.
Our super special topic for today has to do with all the words you hear people using when they talk about your kids' communication problems. We thought we'd talk about these words and give you our take on what they mean. Let's start with communication. Communication is the broadest term that we use when we're talking about how people interact. Communication really means any way of sending a message to a receiver. So communication will always have three parts. There's a message, there's a sender, someone who sends the message, and a receiver, someone who gets the message. Now, lots of animals communicate. Some people even think plants communicate. But certainly people communicate. And we have special ways of communicating, and one of them is language. Language is a particular form of communication. So, Auntie Donia, you want to tell us a little more about what we mean by language?
Sure, Granny Rhea. So when we talk about language, we can actually break it down into three areas. We have what we first refer to as expressive language. So that's the words that we use and how we use those words to convey a specific message. So if I say to Granny Rhea, that cake we had yesterday was delicious, I'm sharing some information about the cake, which is different to saying, what cake are we going to have later, Granny Rhea?
Yeah. So when Auntie Donia expresses her ideas through language, says them, uses words to convey them, that's what we mean by expressive language. The other side of that coin is receptive language. This is sometimes called comprehension, and it really just means that someone is receiving the message. When we talked about communication, we said there was a sender of the receiver. That's the person that expresses or produces the language. The receiver is the one who gets the message, who comprehends it, and that's what we mean by receptive language. It means when I say to Auntie Donia, we're going to have a really good cake today, she knows she has something to look forward to.
And the other thing that's important to remember that you can actually understand a communicative intent in the absence of language altogether. So it is actually possible that I can gesture, that I can even use my voice to indicate something really quite different. So I could say something like, I loved that cake we had yesterday, which you can tell from my voice, I wasn't so enthusiastic about it.
Right, and that's the idea of the difference between language and communication. So while Auntie Donia's language might say, literally, I liked the cake, the other part of her communication sent a different message, in fact, one that could even override the first message. So the relationship between communication and language can be somewhat complicated, and that's why sometimes people get mixed up about it.
Now, quite often when, people say that we're speech and language pathologists, they always think of that speech word in our title. And speech really means the different speech sounds that we use, that we put together to form a word. So a few days ago, it was Halloween, and one of the little girls that rang the doorbell said, "Twick or tweet." And she wasn't referring to social media and tweeting.
Yeah, so speech is that oral expression of language that is conveyed by a set of sounds that are part of each language. So in English, for example, we have a sound like the one that comes at the beginning of thumb, that TH sound. Some languages don't use that sound at all. So if they're learning English, that sound can be really hard for them to say. And vice versa. In English, there are certain sounds we don't have either. So, for example, the ch sound that some languages have is not used in English. And when we hear foreign words that have that ch sound, it sounds strange to us and is hard for us to produce.
So we hope this has helped you really understand those different terms that you may be hearing or even have read in the reports that your super special kids get. Now, the other thing is, what happens when a child isn't perhaps finding those words, or they're using words, but they're having difficulty understanding language. We sometimes see that, don't we, Granny Rhea?
Yeah, we sure do. There are many combinations of problems that kids can have with speech, language, and communication. Some kids have great language, but they talk about the Tyrannosaurus Rex. They might be very smart and have lots of things to say about that Tyrannosaurus, but they can't quite say it correctly. That's a speech problem. Then they might have language problems in which they might have things to say but have difficulty putting together the sentences to express those ideas. Or they might be able to talk fairly well but have difficulty understanding, especially when language comes in quickly or when it's more complex than the ordinary everyday conversation.
You know, Granny Rhea, I find the human brain really fascinating. And I often think of it like a London tube map, where you have some lines that are working really well and other lines that aren't working so well. So when we work with children, our super special kids, we actually help them to use other tube lines or other subway lines for them to be able to better learn to use expressive language or their receptive language.
Yeah, that certainly is part of what we do, trying to retrain some of those pathways that might not be working so well. But sometimes certain pathways are so disturbed that they just can't work at all. And we see that, for example, in kids with cerebral palsy whose oral motor production is so impaired that they really can't speak intelligibly. And then we have to find other ways for them to communicate, such as offering them pictures or electronic devices and so on. There's one other aspect of the language terminology we probably should talk about, Auntie Donia, and that's the whole idea of social communication and pragmatics. Can you tell us something about that?
Yes. Well, it's social pragmatics and communication. As we've said, we've got our expressive language and our receptive language, but this is how we use our language and communication within a social context. And we know that especially for some of our super special kids with autism, this can be a really difficult area for them. And this is where we have difficulty understanding when to say something, when a topic is off topic or not. We actually had a great example a few days ago where one of the students was swearing in front of us in the therapy room, and he's a middle school student. And what we were saying to him was, you couldn't say to him, you can't swear, because of course his peers are swearing during recess, but they're not swearing in front of the teachers. They're swearing under their breath. So it's having to explain to him when we could use certain language.
And that's very true. There are situations when we can talk one way and situations when we can talk another way. The other thing that is important to be aware of is that children with autism are not the only ones who can have trouble with social communication. Now, usually they have more severe trouble, but many children who have difficulty learning to talk and understand will also have difficulty figuring out all the flexible rules that we have to learn in order to adjust our speech so it's just right for the person in the situation.
And also reading our body language. So our faces have a lot of information, and sometimes we think of it that it's our eyes that share those information. Our eyes certainly convey a lot of information, but it's our facial expressions and our body language with our tone of voice that together share a message.
Yeah, there's a huge range of cues that go into fully understanding what other people say. But for many of our super special kids, we are going to focus on the language itself because that is the most problematic. And once we get that settled, sometimes the other aspects of comprehension will come along. We're going to talk a little bit more in today's podcast about eye contact too. But we just wanted to try to clarify these terms for you because we know they're thrown around a lot by specialists who work with our super special kids, and we wanted you to be able to understand them.
So, Granny Rhea, let's see what one of our listeners has sent us for today's super special question. Today's super special question is, what do I do if my child tantrums in public?
Oh, that's a tough one. It's so hard for parents when that happens.
And I think it's a tough one both for parents of super special kids, but also of parents of typical children.
Yeah, because they can certainly tantrum too. Even when they get up to be 4 and 5, sometimes they can throw tantrums. So maybe we should talk a little bit about what tantrums mean. Why does a child throw a tantrum, Auntie Donia?
Well, it can be for a lot of different reasons, but sometimes it's because they're tired. Sometimes it's because they're not able to communicate what needs to happen, or it's just another way of saying, I don't want to do this. And once a child tantrums, unfortunately, there's not very much you can do, and you really have to just ride that wave. And in many ways, you have to ignore the behavior, and as we've shared in one of our previous podcasts, really let them know what you want them to do. So stand up, hold my hand, we're going to walk to the car now.
Yeah, and it's very hard to ignore such a dramatic behavior. But to the extent that you can avoid rewarding the child for having the tantrum, you really want to think about how can I minimize my response to this behavior. The worst thing you could do is give them what they want. That's the absolutely last thing you want to do, because that just teaches them that if I behave this way, then I get what I want.
That's right. And what you may see is that the tantrums start increasing because even if you've let them have the tantrum for a certain amount of time, then finally you give in, they just learn, well, I just have to have a tantrum for even longer before I get that candy or that toy that I wanted. And I think also that for many of the families I speak to and my siblings, that they feel it's embarrassing. They feel that everybody is staring at them, whereas that may be the case sometimes, and you may feel that judgment, but really the best thing to do is to ignore those stares and to just focus on you and your child at that time.
And if you do feel like you have to say something to bystanders, you can just tell them the truth. My child has special needs and it's hard for him to communicate. This is how he's communicating right now. I just have to wait until he's calm enough to listen to me.
And I found that when parents do that, Granny Rhea, that they find that people are either helpful, so they'll either say, can I help? And if you need the help, of course, willingly take it. And other times they'll then leave you alone.
But if they do criticize you, you have the right to ignore that criticism. It's not going to do you or your child any good. You know what's best for your child, and you know that you don't want to reward them for this behavior. So you can afford to just let other people have their opinions.
And I think especially that with some of our super special kids, they don't necessarily have any physical features that would indicate or show that they have any difficulty. And for our super special kids, something as simple as walking through a mall or going grocery shopping can be actually quite overwhelming and difficult for them. So as you said, Granny Rhea, I think if you know that you can comfortably say, my child has difficulty communicating and talking, it's a good model both for your super special kid and it helps you as well.
I wonder if we can think about any ways of avoiding tantrums. Sometimes the best way to manage a behavior is to make sure it never happens in the first place. One of the things you can do is to think about, when is my child likely to tantrum? Does it happen when I go to the supermarket and we go through the cereal aisle and I know that they want the Lucky Charms with the green marshmallows in them? So maybe one way to do it is to avoid going down that aisle or buying the cereal another time.
Yep, I've done that before, actually, where we've worked with a super special kid, and whenever we knew that when he would see the popcorn stand, he would want popcorn, and his mum really didn't want him to eat popcorn. So initially, we just used a different entrance, but we can't always do that. So later on, we prepared him, and the term that we use is priming, which really means preparing your child for what's going to happen. So we would say, we're going to go into the mall, we're going to go into the shoe shop, we're going to buy a pair of shoes, and then we're going to go back in the car and we're going to listen to your favourite music. And so for each of those steps, we guided the child. His mum let him know what was going to happen. She rewarded him by praising him. And she found that because he was more prepared, he didn't get upset.
Yeah, and for some of our super special kids, if you find this is really a problem, you might even want to make a little picture schedule of what's going to happen that you can pull out and point to when you get to each point in your sequence so that the child knows exactly what's happening. the source for a lot of tantrums, apart from just being frustrated because you can't communicate or can't get what you want, is a feeling of anxiety about not knowing exactly what's going on. So if we can alleviate that anxiety by making it very clear exactly what is going to happen so the child knows what to expect, very often we can avoid trouble before it happens.
And we know that, don't we, as adults? I mean, if you said to me, Granny Rhea, we're going out this evening, and I don't know when we're going, I don't know where we're going, I would certainly have some kind of anxiety about that. So the more prepared we are, the more organised we are as well, and supporting that with the visuals, as you were saying. And that's easy to do. I mean, that's one of the advantages with our smartphones now, that you can easily take a photograph of where you're going to go. You can pull it up online so you can actually show your child where they're going and what they're going to do. And that certainly does help and releases, I think, or relieves any type of anxiety.
And there are even some apps that you can use to create schedules on your phone by using the photographs that you take yourself. And those can be really helpful. Then you don't have to carry around pieces of paper or cut pictures out of magazines. So in some ways, life is really good for super special kids today. Auntie Donia, there are so many myths and misconceptions in working with children with developmental disabilities. And some of them are so absurd, they just make us go, arghhh! So, you know what makes me go arghhh today, Auntie Donia, is people who put their kids on really restrictive, severe diets. I know people do it for all the right reasons because they've heard from other parents or heard on the internet that these diets can affect children's behavior and communication. You know, I've worked with hundreds of families of super special kids, and I've never seen one where the diet really made a difference. And the scientific evidence supports that. There's no scientific evidence to suggest that any particular diet is going to be helpful with the behaviors that really affect kids' ability to learn and to fit in with social norms. So I kind of hate to see kids put on these diets because sometimes being a super special kid does limit the things you can enjoy to begin with. And if there are foods that you can enjoy, you should be able to eat them. What do you think?
I agree, Granny Rhea. I mean, I have celiac, so it means that I can't eat anything that has gluten. I was diagnosed more than 20 years ago. And for our children, you know, eating is often something that is social. Snack time, party time, lunchtime. I mean, that's a time when they're sitting around the table wanting to share other things. And I think it's important to remember that children do have food sensitivities and they may have food allergies, which cause gastrointestinal difficulties, but that's not the same as difficulty with communication, language, and behavior. And I think it's important to distinguish between the two.
Yes, and you certainly want to be aware of any allergies your child might have, and those can be identified by a doctor using very specific tests who can identify very specific allergens and tell you exactly what your child should not eat. But most of the diets that are purported to affect communication and behavior really have no scientific basis, and they can really limit the child's ability to be with friends, to go to birthday parties, to enjoy the other things that peers enjoy. And so I just really am sad when I see parents doing that. Now, if you are a parent who really believes that one of these diets is useful, I think what you should do is test it scientifically. Let your child go on the restrictive diet for 2 weeks. Keep notes of how he's doing. Don't tell anybody that you've put him on the diet and ask them to report to you about how the child's doing. Then let him go off for 2 weeks and see what the changes are. Keep your own notes and ask the teacher to keep notes too. If they don't know whether the child is on the diet or not, they can't be biased by that knowledge. And take a real objective look at how much the child is changing. Maybe you don't think 2 weeks is enough. Okay, try it for a month and then go off for a month. But it makes sense to take a look at the real observations that you and people who don't know about the diet make and see if you really are seeing a difference. Because if you're not, it's really not worth the trouble and the restriction that it puts on your child.
I love that idea, Granny Rhea. And I think that's just a great rule of thumb, that when somebody recommends something, that you first of all look to see, is there any evidence? Is there any research that supports it? And then to be a researcher yourself. And if your super special kid is able to report back to you, then have them involved too. I worked with a super special kid that was having some food sensitivities, and they also felt that it would be better for his behavior if he was on this restricted diet. And he actually kept a log himself. And he was able to identify that it wasn't the gluten, it wasn't the dairy that was bothering him. There were actually some other things, but it wasn't that. And so it's really important, as you said, Granny Rhea, to observe.
And work with your doctor, too.
Yes.
Let your doctor help, because that's something that they should be able to assist you with. But try to keep other people in the dark and see if you can get an honest, unbiased view of how your child's behavior is changing.
Granny Rhea, there is nothing wrong with eating cake for breakfast.
You are so right, Auntie Donia, and we're going to be talking about some things that are as much fun as eating cake for breakfast. Today for breakfast, the cake we're going to eat is public spaces. There are lots of wonderful places that kids can see and enjoy. Some kids like going to art museums and looking at the pictures. I know when my son was 18 months old, I used to love to take him to the British Art Gallery because they had these enormous pictures of lions and horses and all kinds of wild animals, and he just loved looking at them. But some kids might not enjoy that, and it might be just too dull for them. So some kids love looking at the dinosaur bones in the Natural History Museum. Other kids really enjoy the children's types of museums, the hands-on. You as a parent need to be able to follow your child's lead about what will be most enjoyable for them. And one way to do that is to try looking at some books that might relate to one of the public spaces you're thinking about going to and seeing which your child gravitates towards.
I'm a big fan of visiting these cultural spaces and going to museums. I grew up in London, and it was something that we frequently did. And I know it's something that I love doing with my nieces and nephews. But as you said, Granny Rhea, a lot of it is to do with the child's interests. And so I know that some of the super special kids love dinosaurs, some of them love trains, and some of them love a very specific artist. And so knowing your child's interests, and as you said, preparing them beforehand is really important. And you can often go to the museum websites, and a lot of the museums do special explorations that you can do for children and sometimes for super special kids too. So I'm a co-founder of a non-profit organisation called Autism Friendly Spaces. And we've worked with a number of museums in New York City to support the staff that work there to better understand the needs of children with autism. And one of the things that we've created is something called a social narrative. And you can do this yourself for any other museum you're visiting. So we have some photographs of the museum. We show them pictures of perhaps an exhibit that they're going to go to, where the restroom is, where they can have a break if it gets too noisy, and they know what's expected in the museum. Because something we've spoken about earlier today was about social communication and pragmatics. And there are some rules that happen in museums. You know, you could be at a rock concert or sort of a jazz concert, and that's where you can be loud and noisy. But generally speaking, in a museum, you're usually quiet. And knowing, for your child to know what's expected can be really helpful as well. I think the other thing to remember is that the time that you spend in a museum. And perhaps the first time you go, you could go at a time when it's quieter and not spend as much time there, perhaps an hour or even less. And then the next time you go, you could go a little longer. And many of the museums in the cities are either by donation or free of charge. So it's definitely worth looking at the special children's programs that they offer.
Yeah, and some museums, even that do charge admission, have special times when you don't have to pay. So those are another thing that you want to look for. The other thing I would say, because we're talking about eating cake for breakfast, is that it should be fun for you too. the best way to have an experience with your child is to share something that you both enjoy. So if you like a particular museum or a particular experience, you can prime your child and teach him about it and convey your enthusiasm so that eventually he too will want to be there because you want to be there. And it's perfectly fine to share your interests with your child. And it's a great way to expand the things that you can do together.
Granny Rhea, what cake do we have to try today?
Oh, Auntie Donia, this cake is amazing.
It looks delicious.
We actually got it from Whole Foods.
Oh.
And it's a chocolate cake with chocolate fudge in the middle and then a vanilla layer, and it's covered with vanilla cream icing with little dollops of chocolate on the top. Oh, it is beautiful, and it tastes so fabulous. I feel so bad that you can't eat it.
But as I always say, say to the people I love, you try it on my behalf. So, okay, have a go. Wish I could try that one too. Okay.
The Let's Talk About Super Special Kids and Cake podcast would like to thank our host, Sacred Heart University's School of Communication and Media Studies. We'd also like to thank our composer, Marty Eisenberg, our editor, Brent, and our audio engineer and director of cake-based operations, Matt Henshaw.